Hi, friends. Today we are going to be talking about the history of voting. This week we are going to be talking about voting in general, the different political parties, different presidential candidates, the electoral process. But today I thought it'd be a good idea that we just start with the history of voting. Some key vocabulary terms I want us to be familiar with when we are talking about today's lesson. The first word is advocate, and that is to publicly support a cause. The next word is called inequity, and it's not fair or equal. If we look at our scale right here, it's unbalanced, and it's not fair or equal. We are going to do a little brief walkthrough of our timeline of voting up to 1971. The first date we have is 1789, and this was actually when we held our first presidential election, too. And it says that on this day, states had the power to set voter requirements, and only 6% of the population could vote. If we remember back in when we were talking about our amendments, the 15th Amendment brought us that everyone could vote, didn't matter what you look like, except for women. But this said that only 6% of our population could vote, and that was usually white male landowners. Even if you were a white male and you did not own land, you could not vote, and this was only 6% of our whole population could vote. In 1856, this was now all white male citizens can vote, and you didn't have to own land. Before, you did have to own land, but it wasn't until almost 80 years later that you did not have to own land to vote. In 1870, this was when our 15th Amendment came along, which what I was just talking um, about how we could not discriminate against race, and preventing states from denying that right based on your race. But we do know that this did not include women. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony, advocate, going back to that vocabulary word, she publicly supported a cause. Susan B. Anthony publicly supported for women's rights to vote, and then she was arrested. And we are going to learn a little bit more about her a little bit later. But yes, she was arrested for wanting the women to write the vote. In 1920, this was when finally, about 50 years later, the 19th Amendment gave that woman the right to vote, and she won. And we won. In 1948, all Native Americans are considered U.S. citizens, and they do have the right to vote now. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more and what that is. But this was passed. And then in 1971, this voting age was lowered to 18 years of age. And we do know that was in our Constitution and our amendments. So, going into more of the Voting Rights Act, in the 15th Amendment said that we cannot prevent people from voting based on their race. But states made this really hard for people to do, even though we wanted people to vote. States were kind of not happy with this. Some states were not happy with this. And even after this was passed, they required expensive poll taxes and difficult reading and writing tests that often made it really impossible for former slaves to register to vote. And then with the help of thousands of protesters, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Voting Rights Act of 1965 made these practices illegal. But before this act, it was estimated that only 23% of African Americans were registered to vote. But by 1969, 61% of African Americans were registered to vote. So when I look at this graph, and when you guys look at this graph, the red line shows the number of registered voters, and the blue line, let me get that away, actually voted for in the election. So you kind of notice how this line, people who are registered, all the way up from 2012 to 2016, why do you think that? First of all, what do you notice about these? And then we'll talk about what you think. So take a minute and pause What do you notice about these? Something that I notice about these is that the registered voters is so much higher than the voters who actually vote in the election. And this, if all of these people were registered to vote, actually voted in the election, this could have a big impact and potentially sway um, presidential elections. And that's why it's really important to vote and go out to vote. It doesn't matter if um, you don't want to or you don't feel like it, but once you're 18 and you're allowed to vote, it's very important to vote because even though you're only one voice, all of your voices matter. And if we had all of these people vote who were registered, maybe our presidents would have looked different. Maybe actually people would not have been president or could have been president because they could have went to vote. But that's why it's very important for us to go vote. We're going to talk about a little bit about Susan B. Anthony. She dedicated her life to equal rights for women. And during the 1872 election, she was encouraged women to vote, even though it had not been legal yet. And she was charged with illegally voting. Now we are going to watch a quick little video getting to know Susan B. Anthony more, who she was. And yeah, we're going to watch that really quick.
Susan B. Anthony, fighter for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820. When Susan lived, not all people in America had the right to live and work as they pleased. Some people were slaves with no rights at all. Women didn't have many rights either. Married women couldn't own land. Girls couldn't go to college. No woman was allowed to vote. Working to change laws and the way people thought was hard. Even the women who cared most about equal rights couldn't always agree on the best way to get America to change. But Susan never gave up. In 1872, Susan put America's laws to the test. On Election Day, she and more than 100 women across the nation went to the polls to cast their votes. Just as she expected, Susan was arrested. She didn't go to jail, but she was put on trial. The judge found her guilty. When he asked Susan if she had anything to say, she leaped to her feet and gave a daring speech. It was no use. On July 4th, 1876, America turned 100. In a celebration in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence was read. At the end, to everyone's surprise, Susan got up and handed out a new declaration, a Declaration of Rights for Women. Susan and other women took their fight to Congress. Beginning in 1887, Congress looked at changing the U.S. Constitution to give women the vote, but year after year, Congress said no. In February of 1906, Susan B. Anthony turned 86. When it was time for Susan's last speech, she struggled to her feet as the audience applauded. Susan's voice rang out clear. She urged women not to give up. "Failure is impossible," she cried. Susan B. Anthony died just a few weeks later. It took American women another 14 years, until 1920, to win the right to vote.
Now for your activity, if you are a virtual learner, you are going to be filling out this section of your virtual brochure, talking about the history. If you are an in-person learner, you are going to be filling this out with paper. And take a minute now, you're going to be doing that. And yeah, have fun. Hope you learned a lot. I will see you next time.